Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time for Hammer Time in Modern, which is based around the card Colossus Hammer, getting onto a creature and bashing your opponent's face. It is a aggro combo deck that pairs Colossus Hammer with effects that allow it to be equipped for free, such as Pure Steel Paladin and Sigarda's Aid, and basically tries to equip it on a creature and kill your opponent quickly as possible. Does have a bit of a grindy gameplay with some of the cards that we'll talk about, but its main A plan is getting a hammer on something and hitting it really, really hard. So Colossus Hammer, as we've already kind of covered, has an equip cost of 8, which makes it prohibitively expensive to actually use. So the equipped creature gets +10, loses flying, but with Sigarda's Aid, which gives the equipped creature, whenever it comes into play, allows you to attach it to a creature, or Pure Steel Paladin, if you have Metalcraft, allows you to equip any equipment for 0, are ways of getting around this particular drawback on Colossus Hammer. The rest of the deck is built around finding ways to get cheap creatures into play or finding hammer. Your ways to find that are things like Steel Shaper's Gift, which allows you to search for equipment for 1 white, Stoneforge Mystic, which allows you to search for equipment and put it into play at instant speed, or Urza's Saga, which is a land for Modern Horizons 2, which is 3rd chapter. When it goes off, search your library for an artifact with 0 or 1, put it onto the battlefield and shuffle. As far as one-shot kills with this deck, you also have access to Inkmoth Nexus. If you're able to get a hammer on this and connect with your opponent, they're dead from infect damage. And then beyond that, you're just playing a bunch of planes and silent clearings to kind of facilitate casting your spells, as well as being able to draw cards off of your silent clearing. One of the advantages of playing the mono white version is you have a little more access of the canopy lands. And then beyond that, you're playing some cheap artifact creatures, things like Memnite and Ornithopter. Esper Sentinel, as a way to disrupt your opponent from playing removal spells and such, allows you to draw cards for the first non-creature spell they play each turn. And then you also have Pure Steel Paladin and Stoneforge Mystic as your remaining creatures. Stoneforge Mystic obviously allowing you to get the equipment, Pure Steel allowing you to equip it and draw some cards whenever equipment enters the battlefield. And then you're playing a bunch of other equipment, things like Cranial Plating, which allow your creature to get +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and you can attach it at instant speed if you happen to have 2 black mana, which isn't always impossible with Silent Clearings and Paradise Mantles and Springleaf Drums. You also have Sword of Fire and Ice, which gives protection from red and blue, 2 of the primary colors in the format right now. And whenever equipped creature deals combat damage, Sword of Fire and Ice deals 2 damage to any target, and you draw a card. Then Analysis, the creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control, which is nice because it also pairs with Sigarda's Aid in addition to your various other pieces of artifacts and equipment. Beyond that, you have Paradise Mantles and Springleaf Drums and some numbers each to kind of get ahead on mana, as this deck is very mana hungry for a deck with such low casting costs, and you often want to empty your hand as quickly as possible, try to get your opponent dead, but you do have a backup grinding plan involving the Urza's Sagas and the various equipment in your deck, especially some of the other variants that we'll cover in a bit. So that is the main deck, trying to execute the plan of getting a hammer on something and hitting it very, very hard, but also has a nice backup plan of drawing cards with Pure Steel Paladin, grinding things out with Urza's Saga, etc. Sideboard is a little bit of a mismatch. You have 4 copies of Hushbringer, primarily here for the elementals. This shuts them down from doing anything when they come into play, so they're not going to Fury you, they're not going to get you with a copy of Solitude, swords to plowsharing your creature, etc. However, it does have the downside that the Evoke of Elementals do stay around, although you don't have too hard of a time plowing your way through just creatures without enters the battlefield abilities with your equipment and such. Draenith Magistrate is an interesting one. Your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. I'm not really sure, other than maybe the Cascade decks where this is particularly relevant. There are some graveyard-based decks, but most of them cast the spells from their hands these days. There really isn't too many things like Snapcaster Mage or anything running around, but this does stop the Cascade spells, which is probably pretty much the main reason it's in the deck. March of Otherworldly Light is a removal spell that you can play against most creatures, and you do have a plethora of white cards in your hands that allow you to pay its alternative costs. And then you have a Blacksmith skill, which is a way to protect your equipped creatures. Target permanent gets hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, and if it's an artifact creature, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. On Thin Ice is another removal spell besides you'll see Prismatic ending in some of these other builds, which is kind of a Chain to the Rocks-esque effect for snowlands, hence why you're running mostly snow plains in this build. And then Pithing Needle and Relic of Progenitus are additional artifacts that you can fish out with your Urza Sagas. Relic of Progenitus being relevant against anything like Living End or any type of Murktide deck, etc. And then Pithing Needle being relevant against Planeswalkers and other things with activated abilities. So another version you'll see is, which is actually the prominent one now, is the mono white splashing blue, mainly for Reality Chip in the main deck, which is kind of a grindy card. As long as Reality Chip is attached to a creature, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. The reconfigure cost is 2 and a blue, so not out of the realm of possibilities of configuring it if you actually have to equip it, as opposed to using Sigarda's Aid or Pure Steel Paladin. Another thing this version gets, since they lost the ability to use Lurrus, is called Aerocomplete, which was actually a card that was starting to see some play before the banning of Lurrus. And this is a living weapon for 7 mana whenever it comes into play. The equipped creature gets +5/+5, has First Strike, Trample, Indestructible, Haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a creature, exile that creature, which is kind of scary when you consider it has First Strike and Trample. And then the artifact itself has Indestructible. The downside is it costs 7 to cast and 7 to equip, which you generally get around with Stoneforge Mystic. This kind of serves the purpose of turning Stoneforge Mystic into an actual threat on its own that your opponent must have kill, as opposed to your Givers of Runes and your Pure Steel Paladins that are already must-kill threats. Another thing in this variant is Giver of Runes, which allows you to protect your other creatures. It says tap to give another target creature protection from colorless, or from a color of your choice until end of turn. Oftentimes your opponent has to kill this, and if they cannot kill this, you are often given free reign to do with whatever you want with the rest of your creatures, which makes it very difficult for your opponent to interact with your various equipment, especially getting a Colossus Hammer on something. Beyond that, this version doesn't get to play the Canopy lands, as it's having to make room for Hallowed Fountains and Seachrome Coasts to be able to cast your blue spells in the main deck and the sideboard. And otherwise, it's sharing many of the same cards, although in different numbers, shaving on some Numb Knights and Ornithopters to be able to fit your Givers of Runes in the deck, etc. As far as your blue cards in the sideboard, this one is playing Lavinia Azorius Renegade. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands that the player controls. Basically, this is good against Tron. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. Kind of serves the same purpose as Drannith Magistrate against the various Cascade decks, kind of shutting down their ability to cast spells, as obviously the Cascade decks try to cast them off of their deck, is how that interaction works. Hushbringer, once again, we've already kind of covered that. It's very good against the Elementals deck. Archer with a Worldly Light, very good removal spell. Blacksmith skill, very good at protecting your creatures. Spell Pierce, kind of paired with your other different protection abilities, is a cheap way to interact with your opponent's removal spells for your creatures or planeswalkers, etc. And then Pithing Needle and Relic we've already kind of covered in the previous deck. This version, one of the interesting things is it's playing Mishra's Bauble over Ornithopter. Not sure how that pairs, although it does give you another card that you can go get with Urza Saga to get a little bit ahead on cards. Ornithopter isn't always the best creature, but it is nice to have a 0-mana creature to pair with your Springleaf Drums, or if you happen to be running at the Paradise Mantle. So this one's eschewing that for a little bit more of card draw engine that you can get. Obviously, the rest of the deck is the same, other than you have Spell Pierces in the main deck as kind of a way to protect your creature, as opposed to something like the copies of Giver of Runes. So a lot of it comes down to what versions of protection spells you want to run in the main deck. This one's running Spell Pierce, the other one running Giver of Runes. A lot of it just depends on like your particular preferred play style. Do you want it as a permanent? Do you want it as a spell in your hand? And another one in this version is a Genius Smith. It's another kind of threat plus card advantage spell whenever it enters the battlefield. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them, put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, or in a random order. And then whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield or your control, get a +1/+1 counter on Ingenious Smith. This ability only triggers once each turn. Basically, this allows you to play another threat that grows bigger over time, threatens your opponent. This part is eschewing any type of like 3 mana or more equipment, but is running a bunch of very powerful spells. And one other card that I forgot to mention, which is actually very important, is Shadow Spear, which gives your creature +1/+1, has trample and lifelink. It's relevant because Hammer does not give great trample, so oftentimes your opponent can just chump block your creature with a hammer. This allows you to kind of get around that effect. And also, a little used ability here, permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, which can be relevant, although decks like Bogles and stuff don't see much play right now. But it is a card and a secondary ability that is relevant on Shadow Spear. This is one of the other pieces of equipment that I forgot to mention that is very important in some spots. And then Reality Chip, kind of the holdover of any of these blue-white versions of the deck. Sideboard, we've already kind of talked about Nettlecyst as a way to get additional threats. That basically, it's a big body when it comes into play, and then any creature you attack it to becomes big. 3 copies of Prismatic Ending, yet another removal spell that you can play. You can generally get this for 2, sometimes 3 if you happen to have a Springleaf Drum in play. So, not the best removal spell in the world, but it does deal with Ledger Shredders, Death Shadows, Tarmogoyfs, etc. Things that could potentially get in your way. This deck is choosing to run Teferi Time Rattler as an additional protection effect. Allows you to play around your opponent's removal because they have to play it at sorcery speed. Also being a pretty good card against the various Cascade decks, both Living End and Rhinos. And then Lavinia we've already covered. This version also happens to run a Relic of Progenitus to pair with the Soul Guide Lantern. So, as you can see, this deck has a lot of core cards, but a lot of customization between the sideboard and some of your flex slots in the main deck. One of the other versions of the deck that did pop up from time to time was a Orzhov variant of the deck. Now, most of the time that's skewed for the Reality Chip, which is a rather nice card, but this is kind of the Orzhov build with a light splash for Reality Chip that you can go get with either a copy of, Ingenious Smith, a Stoneforge Mystic, etc., just as a nice way to grind. In the main deck, it plays 3 copies of Thoughtseize as a way to disrupt combo or control decks from executing their game plan. Kind of gives you an ability to disrupt a Primeval Titan from coming down, or taking your opponent's Cascade spell on a key turn, or disrupting, making sure the way is clear before you equip your hammer to an Inkmoth Nexus to kill them, etc. As far as the sideboard, the only black cards you're going to see is a 4th copy of Thoughtseize, then 2 copies of Dark Confidant, which also, much like Reality Chip, kind of give you a grindy way to play around your opponent. Sanctifier and Beck, yet another card you can play. This is very good against the red decks, whether you're... It's not the best against burn, but it is a protection from red body that makes it very difficult for them to interact with. But it's primarily here for any type of Dragon Rage's Channeler, Ragavan decks, etc., or any deck packing a ton of black and red removal. This is one of those cards you can equip it to, your hammer to, and they just can't do anything about it because they're not really equipped to answer something in a lot of those cases. Path to Exile, yet another flexible white removal spell that you can use to remove annoying creatures out of your way. Once again, things like Murktide and such, which some of the other ones might have some problems dealing with, for the low price of giving your opponent a basic land. So, this deck has a lot of flexibility in its removal spells, and a lot of flexibility in some of its flex slots, but, a lot of the core cards are kind of locked in. Things like Urza's Saga, things like Memnite, things like Esper Sentinel, Sigarda's Aid, Stoneforge Mystic, Pure Steel Paladin, the 4 copies of Colossus Hammer, some number of Springleaf Drum, the Shadow Spear. There's a lot of locked-in cards, but you have probably 6-8 flex slots in the main deck, and then obviously your sideboard you can kind of tailor to whatever you want to beat in the meta. The final version we're going to look at is another blue-white version. This one has a lot of the same things that we've already seen in some of the other ones. There isn't too much new here in the main deck, other than it has a sword and a Caldera complete in the flex slots of the equipment. Reality Chip, once again, we've already kind of covered. They choose to run Giver of Runes as their protection, although they also are running Blacksmith Skill. They're running Burrington Forge Tender. This is protection from red, and you can sack to prevent all damage from a red source this turn. Very powerful effect, once again, against decks like Burn or such, or Ragavan and such. So whoever was running this deck clearly did not want to lose to either Burn or some of the other red decks in the format. And then, Ornithopter against the Memnite. It's very interesting to see the flexibility of the 0-mana slot. The 0-mana creatures are very important in your quickest kills, as oftentimes you go like turn 1 Ornithopter, Steel Shaper's Gift for a hammer, or play a Sigarda's Aid, and then the next turn you put like 2 hammers on a creature and you can kill your opponent on turn 2, which is a possibility. And then some of the turn 3 kills usually involve Inkmoth Nexus or hammer equipped to something and then attack on turn 2 and turn 3. So this deck is capable of very quick kills while also having the grindy plans that we've talked about, with Reality Chip, Pure Steel Paladin, Dark Confidant, Urza's Saga, etc. Oh yeah, and don't discount Urza's Saga's ability to make large constructs. This is yet another series of bodies to help you grind things out, and really can make a nightmare for things that aren't equipped to deal with big creatures. So, while a deck like Burn might be very well equipped to handle most of these cheap, quick creatures, it really struggles with removing, 5/5s and 6/6s coming from Urza's Saga tokens on turn 3 and turn 4. As far as the sideboard, another card to consider for protection spells is Mana Leak. This was a staple for a long time in the Modern format, especially even in the control decks before Counterspell got printed in the format. It is a little bit time sensitive, but this is a deck that obviously can close out the game very quickly. It's also using Spell Pierce and Blacksmith's Skill. This would be a really challenging deck to play around because you get Blacksmith's Skill in the main deck along with Giver of Runes. You'd also have all these various different counter spells that you can unlock or have to deal with. So this would be a very challenging deck of the build to decide what you're playing around if you're the opposing side trying to interact with the deck. So how do you beat the deck? How does the deck fight through the hate? As far as beating the deck, generally you have to have a boatload of removal backed up by some pressure, or just being able to answer each one of their threats. Oftentimes in post board, you're going to see things like Force of Vigor, you're going to see things like Smash to Smithereens, you're going to see any type of anti-artifact hate, as a way to kind of hold things through. Oftentimes, you'll see the protection from red creatures out of the sideboard, you'll see the protection from black creatures. That's because the decks that really give this deck the biggest headaches are decks with generally black-based removal, or a deck like 4-color Omnath with the ability to have all these elementals that come into play and just wiping their board, Fury coming down and answering 2 or 3 of their creatures, Solitude blowing up their equipment turn. All of that can be very challenging to play through for this deck. So generally a deck that's packed full of removal and a way to close out the game can be very difficult for that. Now, as we've already talked about, there's things like Hushbringer. They basically have counters to almost everything that they're going to encounter. But generally you're going to want some amount of artifact hate, a lot of creature removal, and understanding what the key creatures in the deck are. In a lot of the previous builds, Stoneforge Mystic wasn't necessarily a must-kill creature unless there was a Sigarda's Aid in play. The ability to, just do an equipment out of nowhere and equip it wasn't really a big deal until Caldera Complete came in. This suddenly turned Stoneforge Mystic into a threat and not just a way to fetch Hammer itself. And then things like Reality and Chip and such have given them a little bit more grind where they lost that ability with Lurrus, although they could play Reality Chip when they had Lurrus. That was kind of a scary thing. Another card they can play, Meddling Mage. Once again, name your opponent's key card. So, like I said, blue-white, lots of flexibility in the slots of what it does. As far as the decks that are difficult, probably living in decks like Elementals, decks like 4-color Omnath, basically anything that can either mass remove creatures repeatedly, or things that can interact with your creatures very, very quickly, oftentimes taking 2 or 3 creatures out at a time, and can also deal with all your artifacts. So, that said, you can still eke out wins with, equipping a hammer out of nowhere and killing them. This deck doesn't give your opponent a lot of room for error. It's kind of like the old infect decks in that regard, that, one mistake, one slip up, and suddenly you're just dead. But it also has this ability to play this kind of fair white weenie game plan with equipment, and then it also has this kind of grindy game plan with Urza's Saga and the various equipments and such that allow them to draw cards, and then Pure Steel Paladin obviously drawing cards when equipment enters the battlefield. So that's why this deck has been very resilient and kind of lived through all the various different bannings and changes to the format, and one of the reasons why it's one of the few aggressive decks that's still kind of relevant in the format. There aren't too many creature-based decks that are still relevant in the format. You basically have Yawgmoth and this one as the only ones that are top-tier decks in the format. Obviously, Burn kind of is, but Burn's also not exclusively a creature deck. So, you have to have a lot of resilience to what's going on in the format, whether it be things like Undying Creatures in Yawg, or abilities to protect your creatures like this deck does. So, it's one of the reasons why it's still stuck around, although it has started to slide a little bit. Still a deck that will put up results and something you need to be aware of in today's Modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative videos, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and don't forget to tell me what deck you would like to see in our next deck guide. This has been John for MTG Nexus. See you for the next video.